Wrath. The cycle of violence is a phrase that's most attributed to Lenore E. Walker, a psychologist who wrote The Battered Woman, a book about the patterns of abuse people face in abusive relationships. While this concept has existed for years before in storytelling, this narrative put it into a comprehensive phrase. I recently made a video where I talked about my inclination away from single-player games. One of the major reasons is because some games are becoming too long to tell the stories they're trying to tell. One of those games is The Last of Us Part 2. The Last of Us Part 2 was a long-awaited sequel to perhaps one of the greatest games of all time. This sequel, for many, myself included, left much to be desired. This game is flawed in many ways and has been picked apart for years at this point. If The Last of Us Part 2's goal was to immortalize itself in the zeitgeist of video game history, it may have done that for all the wrong reasons. The more I think about The Last of Us Part 2, the more I'm realizing it just did so many things wrong. Even to this day, the game seems to be lambasted for being Israeli propaganda due to the director's personal experience and characterization of certain factions.
We could try another truce, but how long before some asshole on their side or our side unravels the whole thing? No. It has to be all of them.
Speaking of factions, the game completely abandoned multiplayer as a potential experience, and it's crazy how many times Naughty Dog can just re-release the same game over and over again, whilst removing its own stylized design to conform to the modern high-fidelity look that every other game has. I could go on, but it dawned on me very recently that the crux of this story, the breaking of the cycle of violence between Ellie and Abby, is a story that's been told a very, very long time ago. There have been many stories that delve into violence and revenge, but the idea for this video sprung up as I concluded a certain reading in my local book club. I came to the pretty sudden realization that The Last of Us Part 2 is a Homeric story, one that covers roughly the same grounds as the oldest story ever put to page, the Iliad. Now, it might be a stretch for those who have read the Iliad to compare it to The Last of Us Part 2, but it's oddly similar in many ways. For those who have never read the Iliad, it's the story of the Greek siege on Troy, following the plight of the greatest of Greek warriors, Achilles. When the most beautiful woman of the world, Helen of Troy, is dishonorably taken from her husband Menelaus, the Greeks launch a war against Troy. But after 9 years of pillaging, discontent begins to set in across both lines on the battlefield. Leading the Trojan resistance is Hector, descendant of the gods, and a foil to the demigod Achilles. Throughout constant battles and graphic depictions of war, Homer manages to brilliantly capture and humanize both the Greek and Trojan perspective. What helps Homer is that as he wrote the Iliad, he was inventing a ton of narrative structures that stories to this day continue to use. However, modern contemporary writers tend to fall back on the three-act narrative structure, which clearly defines heroes and villains. This kind of tactic is what makes the writing of something like the original Last of Us stick out. Just by breaking the story up into 4 seasons instead of using 3 narrative acts, especially to visually and emotionally convey what the characters' arcs are at those points in the story, defines its own narrative structure. As I mentioned, The Last of Us Part 2 wanted to do something that would make it stick out in the minds of gamers for ages to come. So, what would be more fitting than adopting the narrative structure, themes, and parallelisms of one of the oldest stories ever told? See, at the beginning of the Iliad, Achilles refuses to fight in a war based on a dishonoring he received from the king of the Greeks, Agamemnon. The ancient world revolved on a transactionary system of honor and glory. The transactional nature of how their society worked makes its way even to how the gods intervene in the story. However, Achilles' inaction and refusal to partake in the cycle of violence that had been brewing for 9 years up until that point causes many more losses to the Greeks as the gods tip the scale in the favor of the Trojans. The first half of the story focuses on the struggles of Hector, pushing back the Greeks to their own ships, while physically being outclassed in many ways. But with the assistance of the gods, they're able to overcome many of these challenges. The reason I bring up the cycle of violence is because it's core to The Last of Us Part 2 story. The story, according to its own creative team, is about hatred, an inverse of the original, which was about love. The Last of Us Part 2 makes a point to draw a comparison between Ellie and Abby in their quest for revenge. The first half of The Last of Us Part 1 follows Ellie's downward spiral into obsession with finding the people who killed Joel and exacting her own revenge against them, systematically taking them out one at a time. Then, halfway through the game, the 3-day clock resets to 0, and you play the experience from Abby's perspective. The structure of trying to build up both Ellie and Abby in separate but equal ways is quite Homeric. While many have pointed out that Abby's side of the story uses every cheap trick in the book to make the player feel faux sympathy for her, it is trying to replicate something Homer did very well through the course of the Iliad. Throughout the greater course of history, Hector has become the protagonist in many people's eyes. Primarily, I'm looking at Virgil, the poet of Rome, and Dante's Guide in the Divine Comedy. But Homer wrote primarily to a Greek audience, and one might rightfully think that the Greeks would take the side of their own people in this war. And it's hard to think otherwise, when even fighting against the will of the gods, the Greeks have such strong warriors like Ajax, Diomedes, and Odysseus, who are given plenty of time to show their motivations and prowess in the physical and mental arena. Oh, hey, there's Odysseus. He's a side character in the Iliad, who would become the prototypical Greek hero in Homer's sequel to the Iliad, the Odyssey. And when I saw this, I noticed a very fascinating parallel to the Last of Us franchise. As it currently stands, it is an inversion of the Homeric poems. The Odyssey most closely resembles the journey of Joel and Ellie, together across a pandemic-stricken America in order to reach the Fireflies to see if they are faithful to their word of trying to create a cure. In the Odyssey, Penelope's faithfulness to Odysseus is tested time and time again by constant suitors. So while the first game of the Last of Us franchise most closely represents the second work of Homer, the second game, as I've explained, resembles Homer's first work. I personally believe there's something deeper going on here, with inverting the order of these tales told. Perhaps it has to do with the fact that if you look at the list of Harvard classics, only the Odyssey is there, and arguably the Iliad is equally or more important. The narrative structure of going on this grandiose journey will always be appealing to both creators and audiences, because it allows a bit more creative freedom for how scenes can flow. In many ways, the Iliad tells a more direct and debatably intense drama, but with not only close hand-to-hand combat, but also the introspection the characters have. There was a creative decision from the development team of The Last of Us Part 2 that I never understood until reading the Iliad. When you kill an enemy NPC, their comrades will shout out a randomly generated name for that NPC who was killed.
John! We're under fire! Alex? Sean?
This is something I've seen almost exclusively in Homer's Iliad, though it may be in other famous works, as I become more well-read with the classics. Throughout these very graphic depictions of battle, which The Last of Us Part 2 also took inspiration from with much further gory detail than the original game, Homer makes mention of random soldiers on both the Greek and Trojan sides who are slayed by the main characters, whether it's at the hands of Hector and Aeneas or the spear of Diomedes or Ajax. Homer goes above and beyond just a name drop, but often takes a brief moment to explain the region and the backstory of where this fodder came from. And while you're reading it for the first time, it seems very tedious and doesn't necessarily help you remember all of the dead. But in a way, he's trying to humanize them. And The Last of Us Part 2 replicates this, though I would argue it fails spectacularly, as surviving NPCs shout out the name of their fallen comrades, and then just continue on like nothing happened. In a way, this execution was way worse than what's done in the Iliad, because with the Iliad you had the benefit of a narrator to guide the reader through scene to scene and show you why these characters were important or not. When you play in a third-person perspective of Ellie, doesn't really drive the point home. And this is where I really want to go into the similarities between the Iliad and The Last of Us Part 2, because it's incredibly uncanny. You can easily tell one was written by someone who was competent, while the other was written by someone who wanted subversion to drive the narrative significance to come back to his series, even if it needed to be retconned into existence by changing the race of characters from the first game. The major and dramatic comparison one could make between The Last of Us Part 2 and the Iliad is the treatment of Joel. which undergirds a fundamental flaw in modern writing that doesn't hold a candle when compared to the classics. Within the first hour or so of the story, Joel is killed in a very unceremonious way, in some sense showing the fragility of life, but also setting it up in the worst and most out-of-pocket way possible. The killing of Joel is most analogous to the death of Achilles himself. The greatest warrior of Greece is taken out by an arrow to the heel. While this death is not depicted in the Iliad itself, the story lays the groundwork for why such a seemingly disappointing death is necessary to the greatest warrior. The one to finally best Achilles is the god Apollo and the prince of Troy, Paris, who both throughout the Iliad are the closest characters to being classified as clear antagonists in the entire story. Achilles, a warrior of dominance and unmatched skill in hand-to-hand combat, is defeated by an arrow, which in the context of an ancient society is seen as the weapon of a coward. Achilles was fated to die the moment he decided to fight for the Greek cause. Achilles is bartered by the Greek generals throughout many moments in the play, and holds back not only himself, but the army of the Myrmidons. He consistently makes arguments about the pointlessness of war, and tries to rebuff the honor and glory culture after being dishonored himself. What initially seems like a temper tantrum becomes a very clear and concise dissection of why they were fighting, and how continuing to fight will secure you a short life filled with honor and glory. Achilles himself is probably the only character in Greek mythology who has two fates. One to live a peaceful life and fade into obscurity, but had he chosen that option, more than just his dear friend Patroclus would have been lost. I wonder if this reminds me of any characters. See, fate, in a way, exists in The Last of Us storytelling as well. Joel had to make a choice to save Ellie, but that choice sealed his fate with Abby. In the style of Achilles, he goes out in a way the audience sees as very underwhelming, one in which Joel's survival skills were stretched and tied into pretzels in order to make the scene just work. What makes it obvious is that the writers are borrowing such a fascinating literary technique without understanding how it's properly used. They don't introduce the possibility of retribution in an effective way. The second game hinges on one of the last lines of the first game, that people will keep coming after them. This is true, as it's brought up immediately within the first hours of the sequel, but it doesn't build off of those motivations from the characters until after the fact, as it puts the main character into a situation that players of the first game would never have imagined due to some ideological bent of the writers. For a character like Paris and Apollo to be the antagonist of the Iliad, one must look no further than the fact that Paris stole the wedded Helen, the cause of the Trojan War. The Iliad makes no qualms about sympathizing with Paris to the degree it does with the other Trojans, because it needs someone to initiate the primary cause for this war in the first place. Apollo unleashes a devastating assault on the Greeks at the start of the narrative because of the death of a priest of Apollo's son. The death of the son is woven back to the end of the story, when Priam comes to ransom with Achilles for the body of Hector, pleading with him to think of his own mortal father, Peleus. The loss between parents and children is seen both in the Iliad and The Last of Us Part 2. Ellie's father figure is killed because Joel killed Abby's father. This is a very powerful narrative device, but the challenge is that it's never communicated between Ellie and Abby and why things like this are important. Parallelism can greatly enhance a story when it's done well, not when it makes the characters seem like psychopaths. What modern writers don't understand about the conversion and the new honoring of Achilles is that it comes from humility, a personal connection that Achilles and Priam, sworn enemies throughout this entire war, share in their final moments. After the events of the book, this will lead Achilles to take after Priam's daughter, only to be killed by Paris before he betrays Greece. The conversion of heart and the breaking of the cycle of violence is brought together through dialogue, not more violence. The two characters share a meal with each other, which is the greatest honor one can give to another in the ancient world. This is why the final fight between Abby and Ellie is so underwhelming to so many. Ludonarrative dissonance is at its mathematical maximum, because Ellie has spent this entire game on a quest for revenge, killing countless numbers of people, only to give up in the last moments because she feels it isn't worth it, to protect the image of Joel in her mind. No dialogue was shared, none of this was communicated between the characters, and it's just left underwhelming. This is another area where, once again, it was influenced in some capacity by the Iliad, PTSD after the desecration of Joel's body. The rules of war in the olden days were to plunder and steal stuff from each other's bodies. So when Patroclus is loaned Achilles' armor and then falls to Hector, it's no wonder Hector took the armor, and a whole book of the Iliad is spent with the tug of war over his body because the Trojans want to desecrate it and feed the remains to the dogs. This was the greatest form of dishonor that could befall someone.
Why, that little... He insulted your honor! Sir, I demand satisfaction.
This is exactly what Achilles does to Hector when he is defeated. Achilles stabs and tears at Hector's body and drags him with the chariot by the, I kid you not, Achilles tendon. Despite the brutal release of anger and rage, Achilles is not satisfied, as he's haunted by restlessness and dreams. While this is incredibly rudimentary, it accomplishes everything you need to know. It shouldn't be too difficult for you to see the similarities between this and The Last of Us Part 2. The desecration and regret that comes from realizing it won't bring back the person you love most is a powerful message. While characters in the Iliad express their feelings in long diatribes and polemics, much of the strife of the characters from The Last of Us Part 2 is internalized, and even when it isn't, comes out in the most heavy-handed ways possible. I'm all in favor of not expositing everything for the audience to hear, but even when Homer does it, it doesn't take away from the audience's feelings on who they need to empathize with. Characters follow consistent arcs, and clarity is charity. Look at the sudden and somewhat incomprehensible shifts that characters in The Last of Us Part 2 undergo. The Ellie perspective is a devolution of her character as she decides to push herself to the brink, and Abby generically relives the story of the first game, coming to love a smaller person whom she did not want to be paired with. Both characters pursue vengeance in their own ways, and it all ends the same way. The Last of Us Part 2 tries to do its own thing by jumbling aspects of characters from the Iliad. For example, Achilles is the demigod of the most physical prowess, which is kind of similar to Abby, while Hector fights for the protection of Troy, as Ellie does in a way for Jackson. One of the greatest similarities between this story and the Iliad is the raid conducted against the Seraphites. Talking about great stories, I've got one piece on the mind. The image of a powerful military force invading a weaker, entrenched faction with strongholds burning down is so clearly Homeric that one denying it would need a new pair of glasses. I'm not asking every story to follow the same structure as I mentioned before, but when it's done so poorly, one can't help but point it out. I was recently reminded, with the myriad of Joker 2 memes going around in my social media feed, that the lasting legacy of The Last of Us Part 2 is the ELO meme templates of Abby getting railed. That is an incredible shame to crash the franchise that was set up so well. It's even more of a shame when I can recognize aspects of the classics in this story, yet it doesn't save the series, because you can't just take a few of these ideas and not understand the context in which they were written. See, many of the people who think the Achilles heel of modern writing is taking well-established, white, straight male characters and totally demasculizing them for the sake of a diverse cast would be the primary flaw of modern writing. Maybe right in some regards, it is not the primary flaw in this specific story when it's present. The matter of fact is that the writers clearly didn't know what they were doing when it came to the cohesion of these elements of the story, which were used to such great effect 2,700 years ago. One final note on the structure of the stories. While the Iliad makes it clear that both sides of the war can be empathized with, it does have a force outside of the war bearing down some pressure: the gods. The gods act like an independent party that takes sides at crucial moments to push along the will of Zeus. I've already mentioned Apollo a few times, assisting the Trojans, but Aphrodite would follow suit, for being chosen in the judgment of Paris, while gods like Poseidon, Athena, and Hera are found in strong and constant support of the Greeks. This outside force and pressure is acknowledged by the characters in the story, from the most intense of battles to the most trivial of funeral games. But why this is important is it allows the human audience to empathize with other human characters in the story. And wonderfully, the Last of Us series has its own version of this in The Infected. While the gods' favor could be bought, the infected are always portrayed in a negative light. Similar to the gods, they are not human and can be used to help the human audience empathize with the human characters. The only problem is they become completely irrelevant towards the end of the second game. At least with the first game, they were always important to a degree because Ellie had a cure for the cordyceps in her brain. Now, when that's no longer on the table, the infected just become eye candy, as they're different enemy types that the player must encounter. The writers flirt with interesting concepts in this realm, like the Rat King, but all in all, they fail to use these dangerous foes as anything more than just a moderate inconvenience for the storytelling. When it comes to the Iliad, the gods are always important. From the first moment of the play to the end of it, nothing hits harder than the will of the gods and their own personal vendettas and grievances, which people on both sides of the war come in contact with. The infected act in a similar capacity, though they indiscriminately target friend and foe. Having a looming force in the background is an excellent storytelling technique and was used quite effectively in the first game and the Left Behind DLC. It only took the back seat when the characters needed to face heavy drama, kind of like how the gods tend to butt out of the most dramatic conversations and moments with characters in the Iliad. Quite honestly, The Last of Us Part 2 is a game that keeps on giving in ways I totally didn't expect. By no means is it the most egregious example of bad modern writing, but it does so many things spectacularly wrong that even 4 years after its release, it can still be picked apart in different ways. I'm not the type of person to cope or seethe over this anymore. Those visceral emotions have long left my system. I'm coming back here primarily to tell you about something I really do love, the Iliad, the classics, stories that were written with some level of competency. And while I do hate The Last of Us Part 2, there is such a surprising number of things that could have worked in this story, but didn't. By going through this comparison, I was better able to form a conclusion about the cycle of violence trope in narrative writing, and where modern writers tend to have an Achilles heel. They don't understand the classics because they're too busy destroying them and tearing down not only what made them good in the first place, but what made their own series good. And that's unfortunate to see. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I certainly loved scripting this video in particular more than a lot of the previous ones. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. God bless, and I'll see you all next time.